Before I begin my questions, I just wanted to reflect on the session last week of the Culture Review, as has been said by other Assembly members, and also the heaviness of that session, but also the transparency and commitment you both faced within that session to questions. Acknowledging that there's still serious questions to answer, and you've said many times this morning already in different ways that there is still a huge amount of work to do. This is an ongoing process, but to thank you both for that. Also, Commissioner, your commitment as well to the transparency around the Freemasons in the Fire Brigade that you acknowledged last week, and commitment to LGBT fire officers and disability. And Deputy Mayor, just to say that the Green Group have no concerns about you working 3 days a week. We think you're doing excellent work and will continue to do so. I want to turn to climate, which is a conversation we've had as an ongoing discussion. And this morning you've talked already about how the brigade at times has been very stretched. And you've also talked about, when you look at the data, Commissioner, from year on year, particularly around climate, that things are getting worse, and there is a trajectory there that is no longer, or should have never been, debated. And I know you accept that. We've seen wildfires, as you've discussed, that have meant the London Fire Brigade have faced the worst number of calls since World War II, and we've seen excess flooding as well as damage and structural building collapse. And although there's been fatalities, it's been a close call in terms of those major fatalities, and we've seen those in Auckland, for instance, with atmospheric rivers and other events around the world. So my first question really, is London ready for a major event of a climate crisis, and what happens if there's a rapid succession of events over a short period of time?
We're a well-resourced service that I think can cope with it operationally, and actually part of the changes we've brought through this year is to look at the way we deal with surge demand. So I think one of the benefits of actually a much tighter focus on financial efficiency, ironically, has been about how we deal with surge demand as well. So, for example, by going back to a watch-based training model, that then allows us to recall anyone on training in their operating team groups, means that faced with the sort of conditions we saw in the summer, we're in a different place now where we would be able to recall many more firefighters directly onto the front line. So in terms of our operational capacity, I think we're in a good place, and I think we've got the resources we need for kind of surge demand. So I would provide that reassurance. Some of it is about how we manage that and doing it better, and I think we're well advanced on that journey. In terms of London itself, again, I am not an expert, but it's obvious to me from the operational conditions I saw out in the east of London that we do not manage the rural-urban interface in a way that recognises an increase in risk, and that we will need to turn to other countries to understand how to do that, whether it's about seeing communities as islands in the rural kind of the sort of semi-rural landscape. So putting gravel barriers around vulnerable houses next to large areas of open, dry ground, for example, that you see on the continent. You know, some guidance around planting, the availability of water supply. There's things you can do in the urban planning environment that build a greater resilience into communities, but they come over time and they have to come with a degree of investment. But I think it would be prudent that we look at where the fires happened around London and consider, you know, how working together with other partners we can provide advice in as to how that might need to change.
Can I ask if there's any specifics on what work's being done at the moment then on that rural-urban interface?
Well, we've done a major review of our response to the wildfires. That's just completed. It just came to my board with a series of lessons. Again, we are not urban planning experts. We're the people who respond, but we do know from our contacts with international brigades about the operating environment they're in and some of the mitigating measures, and we'd welcome bringing that into a kind of shared learning environment.
Yeah. Deputy Mayor, if I can turn to you, and actually it picks up on what the Commissioner just said, because I want to ask you about preparedness, looking particularly at that international picture and what we can learn from other countries. Now, in this country, we've seen the 40-degree heat wave. It did last just a couple of days, and I know just one day can cause fatalities and puts pressure on the fire brigade. But thankfully, we haven't seen one that has gone on. And it's the same with the rainfall. Walthamstow, I believe, in a couple of days saw a month's rainfall. But again, it wasn't for a long time. What operations are in place for resourcing for London when we are overwhelmed or when we are totally stretched? I know that we usually ask other fire brigades from outside to give extra fire resources, but what happens when those don't come?
I think they did come last time. I actually spoke to the Police and Fire Commissioner from Essex, who we talked about the fact that he'd sent, or Essex had sent fire appliances. That sounds a little bit operational, so I might hand over to the Mayor shortly. Not the Mayor, sorry. I've promoted you, Andy. But I think that the preparedness piece is really around how the strategic coordination works through the London Resilience Forum, and all the climate risks are on the risk register that we work to, the national risks that we're assigned. These are reviewed regularly, and actually increasingly we're seeing the interconnectedness of the ones relating to climate change, and looking much more at how we take these as a group, because as you'll be aware, we hadn't really been expecting that 40 degrees heat for a few years. It came earlier than we'd expected, which is an issue for us to deal with earlier. I mean, we weren't expecting that level of heat. I think the predictions were that it was sometime in the future, and quite clearly after a heat wave you quite often get significant rainfall when the weather breaks. So there's no point us looking just at extreme heat or drought or flooding in isolation. You have to look at them as a whole. So that's the approach we're increasingly starting to take through the Resilience Forum and through the work the GLA's City Resilience staff do here. But I'll hand back to the Commissioner. But I would like to say thank you for your kind words earlier as well.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Commissioner, can I just build on the question and give you an opportunity to answer it? I guess the question to elaborate is, what if Essex are also facing the same dangers that we are, and so then they can't send resources?
Well, I mean, we did get to points during the day where that occurred. There wasn't the mutual aid coming across the border, and we couldn't provide mutual aid. At that point, each service has got to work within its own resources. What I would reiterate is London is well resourced. So, yeah, it's a very, very difficult day, but you can't resource continuously to the maximum. It's not an efficient way to run a service. What you've got to do is plan effectively for surge demand, recognising it might happen more regularly. And actually, what I would say, it's not just about climate. I would echo the Deputy Mayor's comments. You know, I got a phone call from Grant Emerson, who at that point was running the London Ambulance Service, about a week into the kind of rising event at the start of the COVID pandemic, where he basically said to me, can I have 600 firefighters, please, to crew ambulances? Again, because we are well resourced and we understand surge planning, we gave them to him. So there's something about recognising in London the pressures in the immediate with some sort of significant event, whether it's terrorism, pandemic, climate, is that you've got to recognise there might be times when you have to maximise your resources, stop other activities, and it's the systems that underpin it. And actually, I think we've got a pretty good track record in London. Again, we were the only service in the country that did get 600 people onto ambulances within the context of a couple of weeks. That's because I think the strategic partnership stuff that's been embedded across, frankly, a number of mayoral administrations, you know, including prior to Sadiq, works. But it's about that constant review, going back. All the big services have got into the practice over many years of doing major review after critical events. So I think it lies in both the planning and use of kind of surge resource planning.
Makes sense. Just to turn in a related but slightly different direction, as a London Fire Brigade, lots of people think you put out fires, but of course there's a huge amount of prevention and education there. So I don't want to be alarmist, but at the same time it is part of our role to ring the alarms. I want to ask you about sinkholes, and particularly if any work is being done around sinkholes and how much of a challenge these are. I know the British Geological Survey put out a study a few years back that links potential ground movement to subsidence to properties.
So we don't have a massive... We have seen them in London. I mean, I've attended an incident involving a sinkhole, but they're not... Again, if we were going to look at the kind of rational planning around risk, they don't feature on it. And we would want to be careful not to create an issue out of something that isn't profoundly impactful in very large numbers. So if you want my honest opinion, where we need to concentrate is actually where you've got communities like Wennington, how can we help them prepare to be resilient? It's unlikely to be about sinkholes, but what we did do as a result of what we learnt out of the summer is actually we sent our cadets and firefighters to help communities cut back excess vegetation, for example. So thinking specifically about advice and practical activity that we can use our resources to support in communities to prepare them for kind of the big threats that will affect a whole community. So it's not that I don't think there isn't a risk around sinkholes, but it's not far enough up our kind of risk register to really devote a lot of time and resource, and we've got good operational resources that deal with the immediacy of that. What I'm more interested in would be flash flooding, the predominance of concrete in the urban environment, the need to maintain driveways that aren't permeated over, because actually water, if you want to talk about a real risk to Londoners, flash flooding through extreme rain and the very, very extreme situations we've seen on major roads where people were genuinely trapped in their cars, or the situation we had recently with a different reason for the flooding, the bursting of a water main in North London. We were rescuing people out of basements who potentially, if they were vulnerable, could have drowned if we had not got to them. So I think it's not to discount a risk, but I think we've got some bigger issues we need to get to first in terms of where we put our resourcing and advice.
Okay, Deputy Mayor, I think this is more a question for you. I want to ask about water main bursts, and in particular the intelligence around. A lot of the time, even the water companies don't seem to know exactly where their infrastructure is. What sort of cross-coordination is going on around getting intelligence?
So the water companies are represented on the London Resilience Forum, but as you say, they don't necessarily always know in advance, but there would be places that would be a particular problem. But when there is a problem, then the coordination would normally take place through the London Resilience Forum. And if it's severe enough, for example, the Commissioner mentioned severe flooding, then there would be a strategic coordination group to make sure that everyone was ensuring that resources were pooled and that the response was properly coordinated.
And do you feel like because a lot of the documents about the infrastructure are usually quite old and usually badly documented, do you feel like they're taking responsibility they need to in updating?
I haven't particularly focused on that as a specific issue. I can see whether Shirley Rodriguez has had any dealings with that from that perspective. But I'll look into it because I'll speak to the London Resilience Group about whether they've seen that as a particular issue in terms of planning for where things might happen. What I would say is that if a water company was aware that a water main had particular risks and was likely to burst and cause the devastation, I would hope that they would prioritise it and understand that they do prioritise areas generally, but I can get a more specific answer for you on that.
Thank you. And Commissioner, finally, just to build on that, looking at other work the GLA is undertaking, would something like the National Underground Asset Register help you as an emergency responder?
Yes, definitely. We've got a real interest in risk underground because we've probably got the most extensively tunnelled environment in Europe, if not the world, and it's complex and it's of different ages, and that presents risks both in terms of operation and risk to the public. So a lot of it is well mapped, to be fair, and the GLA actually in my time as an officer has done a range of work around, for example, trying to do a drainage survey, I remember some years ago, but it's complex because of the historic layers of subsurface kind of activity. But no, it's something we'd welcome. Any kind of operational intelligence we can get around the environment people might be likely to operate in is of real use to us. And water supply network particularly, because then if you go back to Grenfell and how we started this meeting, actually some of our challenges there is about the supply of water to us as well, and the continued maintenance of it, and the kind of the water company's role in that.
Thank you both. Thank you, Chair.